Great. Well, thank you, everyone. My name is Eric Naberg, and I am Vice President of Marketing here at Scrum.org, and I'd like to thank Steve Porter and Daniel Vacanti today for taking the time for this, what I think is a pretty valuable webcast. We've got a very large audience lined up, and I think we're excited to get going. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you might be in the world, and thank you all for joining as well. We're going to take you through today a little bit about Scrum and Kanban, make your teams better, and bust a lot of myths. There are a lot of myths out there, and I think Steve and Daniel are going to help take us through those myths and really getting through them as well. So just a few housekeeping items before we get started. A little bit about Scrum.org. Our mission is about improving the profession of software delivery, and that's really about improving software delivery. It's not improving just Scrum, but it's how do you deliver software better? And by bringing together and bridging the gap in these communities, overcoming these myths that we're going to talk about today, I think is critical to helping improve software delivery. A little bit about this series. Scrum Pulse is a series of free webinars. There's lots of themes that we take on, focusing around agility and empiricism, continuous delivery of business value, and building trust and respect between business and IT organizations. They're available at scrum.org/scrumpulse, as well as on our YouTube channel. Check them out. There's about 30 or so of them out there, and we're constantly doing more each month. If you have questions throughout or requests, feel free to tweet at scrum.org and hashtag scrumpulse. And just a little bit more here. So your microphones will be muted throughout, but ask those questions either through that hashtag or through the questions directly in your GoToWebinar browser itself. Feel free to ask those questions and bring them forward. We encourage discussion. We'll be taking questions as we go through the different myths as well. And with that, I'll bid thank you to Steve for joining and hand it over to our two folks today. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Eric. Just want to quickly introduce myself before we get into this. So my name is Steve Porter. I've been doing work with Agile software development for a very long period of time. Like many people in the Agile community, work with lots of different ways of delivering software, lots of different practices. And as part of learning to do those different pieces, was introduced to Scrum very early on. And 3 years ago, joined Scrum.org as a member of the staff who works with my trainer communities around the world. But I did want to highlight that even though I am a Scrum.org member and work with a lot of really great Scrum professionals, I actually do have a Kanban background as well. I was a certified Kanban trainer and Kanban practitioner, and really, really appreciate the practices that Kanban brings. And through that was introduced to Daniel, and I'm really excited about this opportunity for the two of us to work together and to host this webinar. Daniel?
Thanks for that, Steve. So my name is Daniel Vacanti. A couple things I guess maybe you should know about me is I was one of the originators of the Kanban method. I manage the world's first project implementation of all the stuff that we talked about. Which is slightly relevant for one of the myths I think that we're going to talk about later in terms of Kanban's not for product development. It's kind of an interesting one for me, so we'll spend a lot of time talking about that. I've been traveling the world doing Kanban training, coaching, consulting on this stuff ever since those early days of Corbis way back in 2006, 2007 timeframe. I've written 2 books on flow metrics and predictability. They're wonderful cures for insomnia. So if you ever have any trouble sleeping, by all means, please go and grab these books and have them by your bedside. Last but not least, shameless plug here. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a company called Actionable Agile, and we provide the world's leading, what I consider the world's leading flow-based metrics and analytics tools. I guess one other quick thing before I get started. I just want to say a very, very, very big thank you to Scrum.org for putting this webinar on. They have taken, Scrum.org has really taken the lead in terms of trying to build these bridges between these communities. I think we've put up a lot of false walls between what the Kanban community is trying to do and what the Scrum community is trying to do. And I really do appreciate Scrum.org's leadership and doing things like this. So thanks very much for the opportunity to be here.
That's great. Thanks, Daniel. And it's been really great working with you and other members of the Kanban community over the last few months. It's been really gratifying. So I want to quickly start off with a poll here, just to kind of get a temperature reading for the audience that we have here. So let me first kick that off. So just quickly, if I can get people to weigh in on this, again, I just want to get a sense for where the audience comes from here. Give that a couple of seconds here. You can get up around 70% of the votes. That would be great. Thanks everybody for clicking and participating. That's good. All right, it's starting to slow down now. I'll close off that poll and show the results. So interesting results here. All right, so Scrum, people just predominantly doing Scrum. It's 40% of the audience here. Scrum mixed with Kanban, 55, and we have some Kanban practitioners here that aren't doing Scrum, about 12% of the audience. So that's really great. So I've done a follow-up poll for this because we kind of know where people lie, but I want to dig a little bit deeper into this. So let me hit this next one up here. So, and this is a select all that applies. So don't select one, select multiples if they apply, because I really want to get a sense now for, we have people say they're doing Kanban, say they're doing Scrum, say they're mixing the two, but I'm curious to see the practices that you actually use for that. And I'm able to see the numbers as they come in. There's some very interesting numbers here for sure. And based on the conversations Daniel and I have been having about Scrum and Kanban, some of these numbers aren't that surprising. Okay, so we're up around 80%. So I'm going to close this off and then share that back with people. So Daniel, we talked a little about this. You see a lot of people are using the boards, the visualization piece. Great. Certainly a lot of people are doing. High fives on that, because that's really great. But service level agreements, only 14% of people are using service level agreements, and only 14% of people using class of services. That strikes me as a little low for people who say that they are doing Kanban. But what do I know? I'm a Scrum guy.
That's true. The class of service I can forgive, and in fact, I can kind of applaud. I'm glad that those 86% of you who aren't using class of service, good for you. The not published service level agreement, we'll have to talk a little bit more about that.
Excellent. So why don't we go to the next slide here, Eric, and let Daniel really talk about what Kanban is.
Okay, yeah. So in the context of, I guess, the polls that we just showed, I guess this is why Steve and I were having a little bit of a back and forth. I should say, before I get into these practices, I am a bit of a Kanban minimalist. I kind of think about Kanban from the perspective of how we did it way back when, and what are the absolute minimum things that you need to do in order to consider yourself doing Kanban. A lot of you Kanban purists out there might see these as deficient, or might see these as exclusive, maybe. The point here is that I think a lot of stuff has been tried to be bolted on to the whole Kanban method over the years. And I'm not going to sit here and say that if you do those things you won't be successful, or those things aren't helpful. But I do want to get to kind of the core, kind of the essence of what does it really mean to do Kanban. If you're doing all those other things and they work for you, great. By all means, keep doing them. But at a minimum, at an absolute minimum, to say, what do you really need to do in order to consider yourself doing Kanban? These are them. These are they. These are they. I don't know. I'm going to play fast and loose with the English language here today, guys. So the first one is visualization, and I think we saw from those poll results that I think pretty much everybody gets that. The whole idea of anytime you visualize what you're working on, you're going to be that much more successful at controlling and managing the way that you work. The second thing, of course, is some type of limiting work in progress. I think we'll spend a lot of time today talking about really what it does mean to limit work in progress. The third point, I've stated this slightly different than maybe how you've seen this before, and this is about actively managing items in progress. Because a lot of people think, I put up some type of visualization, I limit work in progress, and then that's it, my job's done. Well, actually, your job's just beginning at that point. Visualizing work and limiting work in progress in and of itself is not enough for you guys to establish flow, certainly not to manage flow. And that's why we're going to need to have some active management of items in progress. And that's why Steve was making his comments about service level agreements or service level expectations, which we'll talk about too. Make process policies explicit. This is where the team has a collective shared understanding of what it is or how we work. Our definitions of done, our pull policies, our definitions of what blockers are. I think for you people doing Scrum, the Scrum Guide is, I think, an excellent example of this guide represents what our explicit policies are around how we work. If you're doing Kanban, you might want to layer some tough stuff on top of that, which I'm sure we'll get into as well. And then, of course, improve collaboratively. This is where the team just needs to get together. The people doing the work are the ones who best know how to improve it. So it is incumbent upon them. Those who have the ability to improve the process, you have the responsibility to improve the process. So this is one of those practices that I think gets lost quite a bit. One other quick thing, if I can say this, what's kind of interesting about these practices is not what's said here, but what's not said here. Notice we don't spend a lot of time talking about exactly how you do these things. It's really more that you are doing this stuff. Now there are some things that might be more beneficial or more strategically advantageous over time. But at a minimum, as long as you're doing these practices, I think you can say that you're doing Kanban. So I'm guessing Twitter has probably lit up with all the damage I've done to Kanban here today.
Yeah, and the thing that I love about these core practices, and Daniel, this is kind of what drew us together, is good Scrum teams are doing all of these.
Yep.
They're doing all of these things. They may not appreciate them in quite the same way, and there's additional rules that Scrum includes that help people do these. Scrum talks about transparency. Scrum has the fixed time box sprints to help them work in progress. There's all sorts of stuff that Scrum does. We have more rules around it to help you get there. But any Scrum practitioner who looks at this list and goes, I don't need to do these, is really missing out on some of the core practices that Scrum is trying to give you. And I just worry about, again, these camps or these myths that have come together where it's like, well, we're a Kanban team, we're a Scrum team. Like you can't, that there's these separate camps where all of the stuff that Kanban talks about doing, the core practices, are things that Scrum teams need to embrace. And we've been having these discussions overall around the Scrum Framework and how so many of the things in there align so well with what Kanban practitioners should be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we were talking about this a couple of days ago, as a matter of fact, that if a Scrum practitioner came to, say, one of the teams that I was working with doing Kanban, and they walked right up to them, they would think that this team was doing Scrum. I mean, from kind of the 25,000 foot view, from outside looking in, it looks a whole lot like Scrum, which I think is really rather the point. There's really not much difference here.
Yeah.
So Daniel, there was a quick request if you can just slow down a little bit. Some people are having trouble keeping up. You're talking a little bit quick. Sorry.
So those from the non-Italians in the group then?
We'll both try to slow it down a little bit more. That'd be great. So why don't we, to kick off some of these conversations, again, there's this myth around that, these aren't complementary, that it's a versus, not an and. Let's tackle some of these myths. So this is one that that I know you've heard. We've had some really great conversations here, that Scrum is revolutionary and Kanban is evolutionary.
Right.
We've had some really good conversations here, and you've got some really good retorts to this. Do you want to kick this one off?
I'm not sure that you want me to kick this one off, Steve, but I'll give it a shot. I think the common theme across all of these myths, obviously, is that they are myths, and I'm not really sure where a lot of these have come from. Most of this stuff is trying to spread fear, uncertainty, and doubt, I think. The point of the whole revolutionary versus evolutionary debate is fairly academic as far as I'm concerned. Anything that you've never done before that you try to do, I think is going to be revolutionary change. And if I can, at the risk of obviously alienating the Kanban community even more, I do believe. I'll stick my foot in my mouth here, but I do believe that the Kanban method is a bit disingenuous when they say that Kanban is an evolutionary approach. Because I believe that anytime you try to explicitly limit work in progress, anytime you actually try to follow those work in progress limits, that is radical revolutionary change. The second you tell somebody that you can't start anything new until you finish, something that you've already got in progress, anybody who's never done that before, that is a complete shock to the system. But I mean, I'm sure the thing is, Scrum's probably the same way. I mean, if you're coming from a waterfall background and trying to introduce some of these Scrum principles, that's going to be seen as revolutionary too.
Yeah, I just imagine the first time you're implementing Kanban and someone basically says, no, we're not starting that because we have no capacity. That whole flip to a pull system is going to blow people's minds.
Yeah, it's a complete paradigm shift. It's a complete mindset shift. The thing is, though, once you kind of get over that initial shock to the system, once you can kind of agree to that, what I would consider is revolutionary change, then yeah, I mean, everything else that we talk about in terms of implementing these practices and improving over time, hopefully those are going to be small incremental change, and you're not going to have to do these big, large upfront changes anymore. I mean, I think that's hopefully the expectation. But I don't want anybody coming into this thinking that, well, Kanban has an advantage because it's evolutionary. I don't believe that.
Yeah, and I would also like to encourage people who are working with Kanban that don't be frightened for introducing something major, something that might really shake things up, because that might be what you need to do to become more effective.
Right. But I mean, the same thing with Scrum, right? I mean, Scrum doesn't necessarily have to be revolutionary either, though. I guess it can be seen that way, but it doesn't have to be, right?
The rules in the Scrum Guide, if really understood well, can be introduced to a team without having massive changes. It's the challenge we often see with Scrum teams is they don't understand the essence behind it. It's focus on empiricism, it's focus on done, and if they really focus on the core pieces of Scrum and appreciate that this is going to take a while to become good with it, I think it'll have a much less of an impact than people are worried about.
Right.
So why don't we go on to the next myth?
Well, actually, before we do, guys, there are a couple of questions that came in that I think are relevant to this first myth. The first question from Paul: since a good Scrum team does all of the same things as Kanban, isn't Scrum just Kanban with larger batch sizes?
Can I take that one?
By all means.
Yeah. Batch size definitely could be something that differentiates between the two, but there's nothing in Scrum that says you can't take your work, break it down into small pieces, and deliver those pieces throughout the entire sprint. People do kind of get hung up on this idea that you're working in batches of 30 days or less. So, or if you have a 2-week sprint, you've got a 2-week batch that you're working on. And that is part of this myth that you can only release once a sprint, that you've got this huge batch you're working on. The best Scrum teams I have ever worked with decompose their work down into small, valuable pieces. They aggressively try to get those to done as quickly as possible. When they are done, release them into an environment where your users can use them and grab the next piece. So you don't need to use bigger batches. And I will flip that around, that Kanban, you could have fairly large batches in Kanban. It would make managing your flow very difficult, but Kanban doesn't say what the right batch size is.
You took the words right out of my mouth there, Steve. Actually, yeah. I mean that's what I was going to jump in and say. And I mean, if I can kind of follow up on this Scrum point as well, isn't there? I mean, there's nothing in the and forgive me because I'm not a Scrum expert. So if I'm speaking out of turn here, just let me know.
We will correct you.
Yeah, but there's nothing in the Scrum guide that says things like you can't do retrospectives more than once a sprint. That you can't do planning more than once a sprint. That you can't do a lot of these cadences more than once a sprint.
Absolutely. One of the things I love about Scrum, and I do have to remind people, is the cadences, the suggested, they're maximums, not minimums. You could do planning like events throughout the entire sprint. All we say is at least once every 30 days, pull everybody together to talk about, hey, what do we want to accomplish this sprint? And if you need to replan that work as you go through the sprint, that's what your daily Scrum is for. And if something major happens, I would feel sad if a Scrum team thought, well, I'd really like to talk about this, but our sprint review is in another week, so we're just going to let this fester. Like, no, that's not what you should be doing.
Right.
Great.
Eric, any questions out there? Oh.
Yeah, so there's not really any additional questions. You've got some support though from the Kanban community. Daniel Marcello says he's a Kanban trainer, and he's with you. Keep on going. So glad he's got that support. And he's even put some comments in here that support all
Don't
of
read
that.
those out loud. Read those out loud, please.
Thanks,
Marcello. We'll keep going. So why don't we go on to the next myth? Myth number 2: Scrum is for and Kanban is for.
You
do this one again. So I'm practicing my anger management techniques, right? Isn't that
I will say that Scrum certainly is optimized for complex work and deliveries of products. That is certainly, it's right in the Scrum guide, and it certainly is and there's some optimization for that. I have this where would you not want to manage flow? Where would you not want to visualize? Like, in what case would you not want to do those list of 5 practices? I can't imagine any time where you look at that list and go, well, no, we're doing this. We don't want to do that. Is just craziness. But it's this whole camp thing that we've gained out. Now, on the flip side, people will say, well, Kanban is better suited for service teams, or I don't know what's another way to put the service teams that you hear from Kanban people.
Well, things like maintenance and operations and stuff like that. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, exactly. And please correct me if I'm wrong here, but even people are doing that work that is more ad hoc, maybe less batchy, right? So many of the Scrum practices make really good sense for those people as well. I think anytime you have a team of people who can be pulled together to focus on a goal, why would you not look at Scrum and say, hey, there's good stuff in here, let's use this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the common terminology people like to use is interrupt driven. Whenever you have interrupt driven or interrupt based work, that's suited for Kanban. Maybe yes, maybe no. But to your point, there's nothing to say that those teams can't have a daily Scrum. There's nothing to say that those teams aren't going to be doing retrospectives. There's nothing to say that those teams don't have project work in addition to or other interrupt-based work that they might want to plan for.
Right, and I think we've got an upcoming myth that talks about planning and how, well, we have interrupt-driven work. We really can't plan out a month's worth of work, so Scrum's not for us. Well, I think there might be some myth in there as well.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I think I do know where the whole Kanban is for maintenance and interrupt-based work came from. I do have a pretty good theory anyway where that came from. But from my own perspective, like I said, from the very beginning, I've been using Kanban for product development work. In fact, I think 95% of my experience with Kanban has been in the product development space. I hope I can say, but I mean, I'm working with a company right now where they have close to 40 product development teams that are doing, most people would say is kind of pure Kanban. So
Yeah. So for Scrum teams out there who are thinking, well, we're doing product work, so this Kanban stuff really isn't for us. Our ops people can use that. No, that is not the case. You really do want to look at the practices here and to see what benefit they can bring to product development. Any questions that we're getting on this, Eric?
Yep. So we've got a few questions that have come in. I think some that you'll really like. Can Scrum be used if a 30-day sprint is too short for a potentially usable, releasable feature? What if 30 days is long enough to reach a milestone that can be reviewed and I think it means iterated.
Yeah.
Or would it be better to use Kanban for iterative development where the definition of done isn't necessarily a releasable feature?
So I can take that one. If you're in an environment where in 30 days or less you can't produce anything of value and get it to done, then you are going to struggle a bit with Scrum. That really is kind of its heart, that if you are unable to get feedback from stakeholders on done work within 30 days, that is certainly going to be a challenge for you. That being said, it is something that you can still use the Scrum framework to help give you that roadmap for how to get to the point where you can fit things inside of 30 days or less.
So can I ask a question, Steve, about that? So
Sure.
And again, forgive me, but are the words potentially shippable in the Scrum guide? Is that?
Yeah, potentially releasable. So
potentially releasable. Yeah.
At the end, once a sprint, you should have something potentially releasable. Whether that happens on the final last day of the sprint or whether it's throughout the entire sprint, you are continuously releasing work to your stakeholders to get feedback. It doesn't matter, but that focus on getting something to done, and in this case, done means potentially releasable. And the potentially is really important, right? In a lot of environments, your customers aren't able to absorb work that quickly, but if a team can get to a point that says, if our customers want this, they can have it, that is one of the key that's one of the key powers of Scrum, is that focus on delighting customers and having something that you can give them if they want it.
Yeah, because from a more Kanban flow perspective, I mean, the language that I liked very much that you were saying was talking about the customer feedback aspect of it. Because like I said, from a flow management perspective, it's all about tightening up that feedback loop. Now, whether that feedback is in terms of releasable code or not is potentially neither here nor there. But the idea that we're actually putting something in front of the customers, because the true definition of value is determined by our customers. Whatever we can do to shorten that feedback cycle, that's, I think, what we're looking for.
Yeah.
So I've got a couple more that have come in around this question, but just to kind of reiterate what I think I just heard here is, one, try to shorten it down, and you can use both frameworks to drive toward that. And two, if you think that feature is too big to deliver within 30 days to gain value, you probably scope that feature too large, and you need to look at maybe scoping that feature into multiple pieces so that you can deliver something of value, get feedback, and make sure you're not going now 60 days and delivering the wrong thing. So then the next question that came in, and I think here's a softball for you guys. So for software development, we can use both Scrum and Kanban together?
Yes.
Well, yeah, one word answer, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think some of the other myths we're going to be covering on, we can really dig into that. But for teams out there that think that they have to choose one or the other, you don't have to choose. You can have the best of both worlds and use both of these for any of the work that you're doing.
Yeah, I would say not only can you in many contexts, you probably should be doing both. Some mix of both.
Right. So why don't we move on to the next slide? Because this one, it kind of feeds on this Scrum is for, Kanban is for, and here's that interrupt-driven work as we we do Kanban because we can't plan our work because it's all interrupt driven.
Yeah, can I take that one?
Please do.
So, this drives me nuts for all kinds of reasons. Kind of inherent in this statement is, I think, yet another myth that Kanban is all about, oh, work just gets done when it gets done. You know, we start work, and as long as we're visualizing our work in progress, or visualizing our work, and as long as we're limiting work in progress, work will just get done when it gets done. And that is absolutely, absolutely not the case. Maybe the word plan is wrong here, but it's not that you don't do planning. It's not that you don't do estimating in Kanban. But the concept, I think, because even Scrum now is using the word forecasting. You're still doing some type of forecasting. Now, that forecasting might be at a very, very different level. For example, in Kanban, we forecast at the individual item level as well as for any type of release or cadence. But you're still going to have to do things like answer the question, when's this thing going to be done? Or how many things can I get done by X or whatever? And you're still potentially going to, especially if you're interrupt driven, you're still going to have to probably work within some agreed SLA or things like that. So the fact that just because you can't plan your work, we need to use Kanban, well, you're in a lot more trouble. If you can't plan your work, I think you're in a lot more trouble than trying to answer or should we use Scrum or should we use Kanban question. What do you think, Steve?
Totally agree. And someone actually had a comment up here, question. It's like, what scenarios will only Kanban be applicable? And I've been putting a lot of thought into this because I really do see the value in both of them. And the one area that leads into this plan or not plan or work, Scrum is pulling a team of people together, giving them a goal to accomplish in a set period of time, and then turning them loose. And that planning, that sprint planning we do at the beginning of a sprint, that a lot of people who might be in more interrupt-driven work, it's like, well, I'm not sure what things I'm going to be working on 4 days from now because something major might come up and I'm going to work on that. But that doesn't mean that you can't pull a group of people together who are working on something, give them a goal for a relatively short period of time, less than 30 days, and that length of time, maybe it's a week, maybe it's less, but just say, here's the thing that as a group of people we want to accomplish. Let's do that. And if you're in a more interrupt-driven environment, then you might leave a lot of capacity aside for that interrupt-driven work to come in, but it gives teams a reason to be a team and to focus on things. Now, if you're in an environment where you don't have a team of people that come together to form a goal, then maybe Scrum isn't going to work for you. Maybe it is going to feel a little bit stupid. The only thing I will add to that is if you're in that environment, I feel very sorry for you because I can't imagine working in an environment where I'm just kind of doing stuff on my own and I'm not really interacting with other people and we haven't got a goal to achieve. And the second thing is I tell people like that, you should be really afraid for your job because if you're individually working on something that doesn't interact with a lot of people on a day in and day out basis, you're probably going to be automated. You're going to be replaced by a robot or a script somewhere. So you need to move into an environment where Scrum and Kanban would both work.
Right. So, if I can, I want to circle back to, if I may, I want to circle back to a point that I made earlier, because I think this is potentially the single biggest thing that is missed in any Kanban implementation. And I think from our poll results, we had at least 12% that were pure Kanban and 40-ish% that were doing some mix of both. And so over the majority of people out there are saying that they're doing Kanban. But the number one thing that I always look for when I go into a team and they're asking and they're telling me that they do Kanban is, do they have some type of service level expectation or service level agreement set in terms of how long it should take for their individual items to flow through their system? They should have an intrinsic understanding of how long it takes for work for an item to get through their process. So when they pull, because we're limiting work in progress, that's really kind of the point. Because we're limiting work in progress, when you pull something in to take up space under that work in progress limit, you have to do everything that you can to make sure that that thing flows through as quickly as possible, because otherwise we're really rather defeating the point. We should be studying those types of metrics, and we should be looking at that stuff to understand and actively managing how long it takes for those things to get done.
Right. And I do, when I'm out there as well, and I do run into people, it's like, well, we're doing Kanban, and I ask them those questions, they just kind of look at me, and I'm like, okay, you're just, and I don't want to use the word immature, but you're just doing work, and seems to be no rhyme or reason to it. Like, don't call it Kanban if you're not really doing Kanban, because I think you do Kanban a disservice at that point.
Yep. So, Eric, what questions do we have?
So I've got a couple of really good ones. Actually, one here that I think ties nicely to it, and ties, Steve, probably to a lot of what you've been doing around our professional Scrum developer course as well. Most companies are forcing Scrum and or Kanban work into an ALM tool like TFS or Jira. I've not found a way to organize the work into 2-week sprints while using Kanban boards. Is there a way to set a time box for Kanban and Jira, for example?
Oh, tooling is always a bit of a challenge for sure. I will agree that some of the tools that are good for cadence-driven work aren't really good at visualizing work in progress limits or visualizing SLEs. Daniel, you probably have more experience with tools to help with that. Have you seen anything there that has something to help teams with cadences?
Short answer is no. I usually, well, I mean, the thing is, I usually teach my stuff independent of any tooling. I don't profess to be a Jira expert or a whatever expert. I mean, obviously there's some probably pure play Kanban tools out there that might achieve some of these things. In terms of Jira or anything else, I don't know that I can speak intelligently about that.
Yeah, and I do know if always the best tool usually is just a whiteboard with some stickies. And I know that building some visualizations around your workflow and the work in that workflow to help people focus on the right work and to think about those cadences is really easy to do. If you have the ability to just make changes and write stuff on stickies, but I don't know of any tool that really supports that. So unfortunately, that answer is no.
Shameless plug. If you want to actively manage stuff that's in progress, I know there's a great analytics tool out there that you guys might be interested in.
Definitely to help with forecasting, because we do get a lot of questions in Scrum.
I think there's a question here that's probably more of a myth than a question, so I'm going to ask it now, which is, why do you have to use a Scrum board when you have Kanban boards, presuming you're using Kanban with Scrum?
I don't know why you would have to choose one or the other. We're just visualizing work.
Why can't Kanban board be the Scrum board? Is there right?
Exactly. That. Hence why I brought that up as being more of a myth than a question, because there is no, like you said, there is really no reason that Kanban board can't be the Scrum board. So why don't we move on to the next myth, myth number 4. Scrum teams mature to do Kanban.
Steve, saw you.
Yeah, so I do hear this one often where we started off doing Scrum and that worked really well for us, but now we're doing Kanban instead. And my first question often is, well, what have you stopped doing? Like when that mature to Kanban piece, what have you stopped doing? And I usually have one of two answers. One is they're maturing to do Kanban because they struggle with some of the Scrum pieces. It's like, we're not really good at planning out work. So we're maturing to do Kanban because we need to do less planning, which we just busted in the previous myth that no, in Kanban you do have to actively manage your work, which requires something that certainly looks a lot like planning. The other piece that I hear teams talk about here is around we found that some of the Scrum things didn't provide us value anymore. We don't need a Scrum Master anymore. We don't need cadences anymore. That's another one, right? We're cadenceless. We're just flow machines now, and work comes in and we flow through it, and that's what we're doing. And I think you talked about having some experience where, because you're often brought in to help Kanban teams, and you look at some of the Scrum practices and go, it actually might be useful if you would look at some of the Scrum stuff that either you're not doing at all, or either you've never done, or that you've given up, and actually go back and look at those and see if they might actually be valuable.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, not that Scrum has a monopoly on stand-ups or retrospectives or things like that, but any Kanban team that doesn't do those types of practices, I'm not sure how they can be successful. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think another way to say this is maybe we could say that Kanban teams mature to Scrum potentially, in some weird world, as well. So I think I think the maturity comes from understanding the right mix of both, so that we can be as successful as possible. So I don't think it's that one matures to another. It's how do we find that right mix of both that works for us in our context.
Yeah, and mix, and we've gone back and forth a lot about that mix leads to the next myth in our series. But before we go to that, are there any questions that touch on this? Let's move to that next myth, because this is one that we're hearing all the time.
And no major questions here. One, for example, knowing that Kanban is just the Japanese word for card, and a user story can be a card, if you limit the work in progress to, say, a certain number of story points or what have you, then we've integrated Scrum and Kanban, haven't we?
I would caution you, the Kanban isn't just about limiting WIP inside of a sprint. I mean, you need to actively manage that work, and I would just caution teams to they run the risk of doing a very shallow Kanban implementation if they just think about, well, we're only pulling in so many story points into a sprint, we're done. Right? I think there's much more to it in Kanban than just using that sprint cadence to limit your work in progress.
Yeah, I have to be honest with you. I'm not sure that I totally understood the question. I kind of got hung up by the first sentence. I think that's really where this is where Kanban has failed in the marketing department. I think is the word Kanban itself can mean many different things to many different people. We can be talking about the Japanese word. We can be talking about the type of pull system. We can be talking about the method itself. We can be talking about the board itself, right? I mean, depending on the context, the word Kanban, I think, can have like 5 different meanings, which is extremely unfortunate because we're constantly having to figure out, well, you're talking about just the board, you're talking about the method, or you're talking about something else. So
I like to think Scrum's done a really good job of helping people understand what Scrum is.
I think tied to that, a question that just came in from Stefan. Are there areas where Kanban contradicts Scrum or Scrum contradicts Kanban?
So, I mean, if I may, contradict, I think, is a bit of a strong word. The only thing I would say is there are certain things that I think the Scrum Guide points out that you don't necessarily have to have in Kanban, but you would never say that you're not doing Kanban for having these things. For example, a Scrum Master. Kanban, in those 5 practices that I showed earlier, nowhere in there is the role of a Scrum Master. But if a Kanban team had somebody called a Scrum Master, and this happens all the time, by the way, you would never say that they're not doing Kanban because of it. So yeah, it's not really more about contradict. It's, if you think of maybe about a Venn diagram, it's about where they overlap or where maybe they don't overlap. That's my 25 words or less answer.
Yeah, and I often think again that they are very complementary. and they just, I think they do allow you to get more out of each of them when you combine the two of them together.
Yeah, I mean, if just very quickly, if I can say, because I've been talking to Steve and the other people in the Scrum.org community, I mean, I'm gonna come clean. I never read the Scrum Guide end to end until this year. And any Kanban purist who picks up the latest version of the Scrum Guide and reads it cover to cover, they're off the top of my head, I can't think of anything that they would object to. I mean, honestly, there shouldn't be anything that they object to.
Yeah, I agree, and that's why I started at the beginning talking about Scrum, looking at those 5 practices. You should not be looking at any of these practices and say we won't be better if we look at these. These will improve us.
Great. So let's move on to the next question. And there's a lot of questions that I've held off asking because I knew this myth was coming up. ScrumBan, what is it? What isn't it?
Ugh is right. Whenever I see this word, I'm always it's like, so what are you not? What are you losing when you're doing ScrumBan? Like, what Kanban practices are you not doing? What Scrum practices are you not doing? Like, if by ScrumBan you mean Scrum and Kanban and you're doing both of them, then okay, yeah, great. But as soon as I see this mashup of words, my first thought is you're cherry picking.
Yes, you're trying to do both and not doing either very well.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to steal that one. That's a great way of putting it in.
I've been waiting the whole webinar to say that, Steve. I'm waiting the whole webinar. So.
Excellent. Again, if ScrumBan to you means you're just doing both of them simultaneously, then great. But then just call it Scrum and Kanban. You're doing both. But if ScrumBan means to you that we don't have a Scrum Master, but we're doing flow and those sort of pieces, I would challenge you to look at the things that you've left out and really, like, why would you leave those out? They're such good practices.
Yeah. I mean, so that everybody knows, as far as I'm concerned, the term ScrumBan came from a book written by a guy by the name of Corey Lattice, and Corey was at Corvus when Kanban was first starting, and he went out and he wrote a whole bunch of blog posts on how to use both of these methodologies together, which is, obviously a wonderful thing that you should be doing. Those blog posts then got published as a book, and somehow what was written in that book got picked up as some formal methodology, I think.
Yes.
And I think that's really kind of the point of this webinar is, I don't know that ScrumBan is its own thing. I mean, you're doing Scrum and Kanban together. I don't think it's its own separate thing that's different than Scrum or different than Kanban. And so that's why I personally think this word dilutes that message and confuses the marketplace. I try not to use it as much as I can.
Yeah, and I do that. The marketing, the messaging around Kanban can certainly be a challenge for people that Scrum's got a bit of a leg up there, right? When people say they're doing Scrum, I can point them at the Scrum Guide. Whether people actually read it or not, or whether they follow it or not, that might be another thing. But at least it's there for everybody to use. Whereas Kanban, not quite so much.
Yeah.
There must be some questions about this, Eric.
Yeah, Eric, hit us with it.
And one of the questions actually was a comment from Marcelo, which is, it's not ScrumBan, but it's Scrum and, right? And it's using those practices and doing Scrum and using the Kanban practices that make sense within it. So thank you for that. There's a question: is the term a methodology or a framework? What do you see as the difference, and how do those fit together?
I could talk from the Scrum side of this thing. Like, Scrum is a framework. It's a collection of rules, practices that form a framework for you to build processes that will help you deliver the goal of Scrum, which is to empirically build products in a complex environment. So For me, the difference, and everyone's got a different way of talking about this, but a methodology is here's a whole bunch of stuff you can do, a whole bunch of stuff, and you pick and choose what's going to work and what doesn't work for you. Scrum is just a really simple set of tools that are barely sufficient to do anything. The expectation is you're going to have to add things on top of it, but it's the bare minimum. And I'll let Daniel talk about this, but I look at Kanban and see some similarities there.
Yeah, that type of question, honestly, it makes my head hurt because it leads to an academic debate that I think gets both sides very, very angry and doesn't really add too much value. Yeah. So, is Kanban a methodology? Is it a framework? I know the in vogue term for the Kanban method now is to call it a method. But as far as I'm concerned, I don't know. You call it whatever you want. If it works, great, keep doing it. If it doesn't work, don't. I don't know what to say other than that.
Right. Eric?
Great. So another question that came in is, do I have to have an IT technical background to use Scrum and Kanban?
Daniel, why don't you take that one first?
Well, okay. So I don't know what Scrum's position on this, but for Kanban, absolutely not. In fact, that's been kind of the one of the stronger points, I think, of Kanban implementation is it doesn't necessarily assume any type of context or domain. In fact, I think we just talked about, or we just heard earlier, that the most famous example of applying these types of principles is in car manufacturing. Not that that was necessarily the beginning of it, but you've got Kanban for all kinds of different contexts: marketing, sales, services, activations, all kinds of stuff. So I imagine Scrum is the same way.
It is. It's interesting. The Scrum Guide talks not at all about software. It does talk about product development, complex environments, those sort of pieces, but lots of different disciplines go into building, delivering a product. So this isn't just about coders and testers. Like, you need so many more disciplines, specialties to produce something of value. And I think Kanban and Scrum work well in those environments.
Great. So here's one I know you'll love, Steve, and from Todd. I always thought Scrum used estimation and story points while doing 2-week sprints, while Kanban did continuous flow. Is that not true anymore?
So just quickly from the Scrum side, story points are an interesting practice. If they help you, great, use them. Items in the product backlog, you do need to think about how large they are. So there's some estimation items in the Scrum Guide, but how you do those, it's totally up to you. There is that cadence, and you're expected to, inside that cadence, to produce something potentially releasable. But again, if you can have in a 1-month sprint 4 releases a day inside that 1-month sprint, then high five. And you're still getting the power of Scrum because you're having those regular cadences to set goals, to get your team together once a day, to at least once a month review what you've worked on with your customers. And you can certainly review stuff with your customers that has been sitting in a production environment for 3 weeks gathering analytics. So it doesn't mean you need to wait till the review to release something. And then retrospectives, again, at least once every 30 days, get together with your team members and come up with some ideas to improve. But if you want to do that throughout the sprint, one of the things I've always loved about SLEs is when you get close to breaching an SLE, the great conversations that it triggers inside a team. To me, that's a trigger for a retrospective. It's like, why did this work normally takes about 8 days to get done? We're at day 7 and this thing has barely moved. WTF, let's talk.
Right.
So I've got one here for Daniel, but just to that point, Steve, there's nowhere in the Scrum Guide that says you have to estimate or what type of practice to use to estimate. It's one good practice to use so you understand the scope of work, but it's certainly, and we have a lot of people now teaching Scrum with no estimates. So there's a lot of work going on there. Daniel, so which metrics from Kanban can be implemented in Scrum? I know you're a metrics guy, so I figured I'd give this one over to you.
Thanks. Well, I guess so. First of all, I don't know that there is such a thing as a Kanban metric. I don't know what that really means. And so I know I'm probably being pedantic and I'm splitting hairs here. So I apologize to the asker of the question for that. But to me, it's really about flow metrics. And the flow metrics I talk about, there are three basic metrics of flow. And as far as I'm concerned, all of these can and should be measured in a Scrum context. And those three metrics are something that I call, here's yet another debate. Maybe this is for next time. But it's something that I call cycle time. And cycle time is the measure of elapsed time that it takes from when you start something to when you finish it. Total elapsed time. I'm calling that cycle time. That's one flow metric. Another flow metric is something that I call throughput, and that's the measure of how many items, count, not story points, but a count of items that you are completing per unit of time. So I'm getting 2 stories done per day or 5 stories done per week, etc. That's a measure of throughput. And the last basic metric of flow, and probably the most important, is work in progress, total work in progress. And the reason that work in progress is such an interesting metric or such an important metric is because how many things you work on is usually the biggest influencer of both how long it takes you to get stuff done, cycle time, as well as how many things you can get done, throughput. So those are the 3 basic metrics of flow that I tell teams to start with. And by all means, if you are not measuring these things in a Scrum context, I think you should. But the thing is, it's so easy to measure these things. So continue to, if all that other stuff, like Steve was talking about, if all that other stuff is working for you, great. But maybe give measuring these things a shot and see if they maybe add a little bit more insight, because it doesn't take too much effort to get that data.
And you just knocked off about 5 questions with that answer. So thank you, Daniel. We've got time for 1 or 2 more, I think. One which I think you guys kind of hit on already, but I think there's an important point here, so I'm going to ask it. My understanding was that ScrumBan was both Kanban and Scrum, removing the fixed time box, so you'd have more continuous delivery. Am I wrong? And I think you guys talked a lot about this already, which the time box is important so that we have something to review, so we have something to reflect on and so on. But if you guys want to maybe just take a minute to maybe address that a little bit further, that might be great.
I've got a quick answer for that. And if you don't want to tie the time box cadence, that isn't your release cadence. And I think that's the key misunderstanding for people. There's nothing wrong with cadences. And if you do release on a larger cadence, let's say you do release once every 2 weeks, I guess that makes me a little sad. If you could release sooner, that would be good. But don't assume that because your sprint is 2 week long, that has to be your release cadence. You should be flowing work to production as often as it makes sense. But the cadence is still good for setting goals, for coming together as a team to do those other pieces. So don't throw out the good flow stuff for continuously releasing value to your customers. Don't throw out one thing to not get the benefit of the other. And that cadence is bringing teams together on a regular basis.
Ditto.
Okay. So
with that, I think we have a couple of more slides to go through, and then we'll call it a day. Daniel?
Oh, yeah, so just very quickly, if you guys want to learn more about predictability in general and the metrics that I talked about for predictability, there's 2 wonderful books written probably by the world's best author on these topics. There's Actionable Agile Metrics for Predictability, which is kind of a deep dive into the analytics themselves. And then there's one that's really oriented more around how to do forecasting with that data, which is called, hopefully appropriately, When Will It Be Done? So I encourage you to check out both of those.
And one thing I will, just quickly before people take off, so don't drop out before I ask to make this one final ask. Daniel and I have been working on something over the last few weeks, and we're going to be working on this in the future. And this is Daniel working with Scrum.org to help codified to help give guidance to Scrum teams who are doing Kanban. And we've tentatively titled it, Daniel, as the Kanban Guide for Scrum Teams.
Yes.
And to help provide a little bit of additional guidance for teams that would like to do Kanban inside a Scrum context. And I'm just curious, because people are hopefully still, they're starting to drop off. If just really quickly, if you could go into the app and raise your hands if you'd be interested in something like this, if having some practices written down a little bit more directly codified to help teams who are doing Scrum embrace these Kanban practices, whether that would be something that would be of interest to you. And I'm watching the numbers go up, and you've got 25% of the audience, and it's going up here. So good. So Daniel, the work that you and I have been doing looks like it does have an audience. That
Excellent.
Makes me happy.
So I guess can I say add something to that? I mean, one, if you would like to see, I hope I can make this offer. You guys can slap my wrist later. If you would like to see a webinar on that, I mean, let us know. We can probably, once that's in a more shareable form, we can probably do that. As well as if there's stuff that you guys wanted to hear more about Scrum and Kanban that we didn't cover in this one, we definitely want to hear about that as well. Because if you enjoyed this, we can certainly do another one.
Absolutely.
Some topics we didn't get to.
So reach out to us on Twitter. The one thing I've just noticed, my Twitter handle is incorrect there. It's Steve VR Porter, but you'll be able to find me online. Don't worry about it. Reach out via Twitter or LinkedIn or any other channel you have. Let us know if you found this useful, and if you'd like us to go in depth into more topics, we would love to engage with you.
Right. I just want to say thanks again to Scrum.org for putting this together. I mean, you guys have done a great job in trying to advance some of this reaching a common ground and building bridges. So really, thanks very much. I was really happy to be here. Enjoyed it immensely.
Great. And thank you, Steve. Thank you, Daniel. And thank you to the audience. By the way, Steve, lots of hands came up on your questions. So not only are people interested, but they were actually paying attention. So with that, I will say thank you all. If you do have questions, feel free to reach out to us, to Daniel, or to Steve, and I'm sure they'd be very happy to help you. Thank you, and have a good day.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining. Bye.
Bye, everyone.